Hi, my name is Anastasia Opara, and I'm very excited to welcome you to Creativity of Rules and Patterns, Designing Procedural Systems, where we will mostly focus on how to approach the procedural layout generation and placement on the example of the Pikapika project that we put together at SEED. And to give you more context, SEED is a research division of Electronic Arts. We are a cross-disciplinary team within EA Worldwide Studios, and our mission is to explore, build, and help define the future of interactive entertainment via creative and technical exploration. And one of our recent projects, Pikapika, is an exploration of hybrid real-time ray tracing rendering, deep learning agents, and procedural level generation, the result of which is an exploratory mini-game for AI agents built in SEED's Halcyon R&D engine, where AI learns how to navigate and interact with the environment via reinforcement learning. And if you're interested to know more about the rendering or the deep learning agents, I do recommend to check our SEED's blog, the link for which I have at the end of the presentation. And this talk will focus on the procedural side of the project. So our art team was 3 people in total, including Paul Griffson, Ken Brown, and myself. In the end, for time efficiency, we decided to have most assets as pre-made to divide the workload, though some parts as walls, floors, and conveyor belts are still procedurally generated meshes. At some point, we had almost a full restart of the art, in particular the procedural system, which was redone like 90% of it. And I found it to be a very interesting case study that brought up a few important questions, such as what is appealing and what is boring, and how do you define it procedurally? We often think of rules as something rigid and constraining when it comes to art process, and an idea of defining your art direction in a set of very specific instructions might seem like a daunting, if not an impossible task. A lot of times, creative process is this fascinating, dynamically evolving collaboration and contribution of both conscious and non-conscious decisions. And the latter are very hard to trace. Why did we decide that this color is better than the other, or this particular arrangement feels pleasing and relaxing? Even though we do not directly register it, we are pattern-seeking addicts that are always in a search for the next fix that will allow us to better encapsulate our surroundings into inner representations. And by better, I mean more compact, not necessarily more truthful. As you probably know, brain lies to you a lot by overgeneralizing, assuming, stereotyping, mixing opinions with facts. But those are actually, in my belief, mind-blowingly amazing mechanics that allow us to process huge amount of information on daily basis. Just imagine if you had to relearn a concept of a car or a house every time you face a new data point. You wouldn't be able to leave your house in the morning just because you would have to be refamiliarized with your own bedroom, which in hindsight would be a pretty curious excuse why you're late at work. So let's just start moving to the main question. What makes us label things as appealing or boring? It might seem like a very trivial question, but you'd be surprised how automatic this evaluation happens in our brain. How often do you find yourself just feeling that something is off, and it takes a considerable effort to translate it into words or feedback? But if we do define appeal and boredom and reverse engineer what tickles our brains, we can use this knowledge when it comes to defining our own procedural rule set. To give you a visual example, here is a pentagon, a simple shape with easily deconstructible rules. And since it is effortless for our brain to trace the dependencies, we can say it's too simple and familiar, therefore boring. It doesn't introduce any new information for our brain to improve its existing models. That is why it is a very easily predictable model. But if you just add one more simple rule on top of it, where for every point of the pentagon we copy it n times with a certain scale and rotation, and by repeating the simple rule again, we get a more interesting looking shape. And all of a sudden, the brain is engaged as we challenge it with somewhat less straightforward dependency. We taunt it to make sense of the raw visual input as clearly as there is some kind of other underlying rule set and configuration similar to the ones we engaged before, but with a slightly different twist. So the brain starts to maniacally search for a pattern once it predicts it is possible to find one. And this process of revealing previously unknown dependencies gives us pleasure, as I believe it is rooted in our primal survival reward mechanisms. However, if dependencies are untraceable, like for example a noise, that is quite tiring as our brain simply cannot find any pattern to cling to. It's too incomprehensible and unrelatable to any previous data, and therefore it is also labeled as boring or unengaging. So the maximum of the interest function has to be somewhere in between, something close to our existing models of the subject, but with a slight twist that your brain goes like, didn't know that can happen. Let me update my variables so we can better predict it next time. But suppose we have an interesting looking procedural object. But what if we want to scale our generation up by introducing many instances of it? Let's say we have a house generation system and now decide to make a village of sorts. Well, suddenly, despite establishing previously that we do have an object with stimulating rules, we are faced with a new situation where our brain no longer looks for those details in a single occurrence, but analyzes everything in a big batch at once. And for a computer, those will totally be different houses you just scattered, but for the brain, it becomes a piece of cake to establish that those are copied objects with slight permutations. And our brain chunks that super easily, thus becoming bored. So surprisingly, by increasing the number of object occurrences, we decreased its overall interestingness. Therefore, a good point to keep in mind is supplying engaging dependencies on every scale. And here I just use the same setup, but instead of copying the pentagons, I use them for placement, which brings me to another important takeaway, that rules are just building blocks, and it is a highly creative process of arranging them into new patterns and dependencies. Like, for example, this is again the same system but with various input shapes, and it produces quite a variety from the same simple setup. And it is important that your setup maintains an engaging structure, because it is exactly the problem we had in the first iteration of our level layout system. It was way too unstructured and random. There was no engaging internal logic going on, and it is crucial to supply logical constraints that tie to our existing experiences, in this case our idea of a factory and what we expect to see from it. So in order to counter that, the system was redesigned to have a central piece and compositional guidelines, and once those blocks were in place, it was easy to start building on top of that. I like to think of rules assembly as a language. And language, in my opinion, is one of the most amazing inventions that is aimed to align our inner, highly varied data representations to a more generic and translatable between multiple parties form. And that form is not necessarily the conventional communication used by a specific country like English, French, or Swedish, but literally anything that can be used to trigger your internal abstractions and pass some sort of information. I like to visualize language as a handle that triggers certain inner connections. For the convenience, I'm going to use English as a trigger here. Let's say we read rabbit, and that points to a certain location of our inner data that is also intertwined with a lot of other associations, both cultural and biological, we might have related to the concept of rabbit. Biological meaning we probably considered harmless due to our ancestral heritage of interacting with a species. Cultural can be the antonym of a wolf, as those usually put together in a fairy tales as opposites, or a symbolic meaning of innocence. But what is more interesting is combinations of words and how you can manipulate this association chain. For example, what does "she had lush spider eyes" sentence make you think? What parts of your inner abstractions does it pull? In that regards, I really enjoy poetry because of new words connections it unravels that just twists my brain into absolutely bizarre associations, and it feels good. Which also makes me question, is creativity about revealing previously unfamiliar connections? Is it about combining concepts into new mixtures and thus creating new meanings? Is this why procedural generation is such an addicting activity? Because you're discovering models that describe the visual surrounding world. But anyway, I'll give you a sec to think about the spider-eyed girl. Okay, so did you have enough time? Because I'd love to hear what your brain conjured after the presentation, actually. But for me, the brain is kind of pulled an interesting association with a little young girl that has just too much mascara on her, and individual eyelashes start to glue to each other, creating thicker streaks that remind me of tarantula legs. At the same time, a contrast between a cute girl and a spider triggers two conflicting parts of my brain, such as, "Aw, cute," and "run for your life, burn it with fire," which is also a particularly interesting mixture. And cute reaction is, of course, attached to the spider. I tend to run away from cute girls. But why am I even talking about combining words into meanings right now? Well, that is because I want you to see language as a constructor, a system of words that are linked together to pass information. Some of the word functions require previous data to be interpreted correctly. Like, for example, here, Sam jumps over a puddle. He landed right into it, where he is Sam and it is a puddle, but without a previous sentence, we wouldn't be able to derive it. Therefore, there is an informational link between those words, and those links can be very complicated dependent on the text. And doesn't it just conveniently remind you of anything? I mean, isn't that what Houdini networks do as well? They take, process, and pass information and can also change meaning based on the input or previous words in Houdini's sentence. They can link to multiple nodes at the same time and take information from a completely different part of the network. So it becomes evident that one has to build his or her vocabulary to be able to express themselves better with this language. And then just play with words. Be poetic. Make Houdini love poems. Define new words by describing them with existing ones, by which I mean digital assets, because what are those if not new vocabulary? And sometimes the sentence just comes to us, and all we have to do is write it down. But often it is a process of playing around. So get to know your idea. Flirt with it. Learn how to better approach it. Be experimental. Mix things up that seem non-obvious. Creative process is often very messy, and that's all right. You go through many iterations of your algorithm before you arrive at something amazing, like this amazing link of words or rules that just fit so beautifully together. And when it comes to building the rules, don't try to do everything at once. Start simple. Treat proceduralism as if it was a painting, where you start with bigger shapes, the foundation and proportions, and then you go into smaller details. And that is actually a point that played a very important part during the creation of procedural system for Pikapika, which kickstarted quite an interesting research on visual balance and composition. How do you create a visually pleasing layout and assets arrangement? And I want to add special thanks to Kim Goossens for the inspiration regarding the topic, and especially sharing one of his files that influenced my further work. The key idea, however, came from the book called Art and Visual Perception by Rudolf Arnheim, where he showed the following image on the left, which was associated with the placement of a single black disc on the canvas and tracking how balanced or non-balanced its location felt. And via informal exploration, he concluded that there were invisible points of influence on the canvas, which he called structural skeleton. And on the right, the disc was moved to various locations, and subjects were asked to indicate whether it exhibited a tendency to strive in any direction, and if so, how strong this tendency was. And we can clearly see that just mere location of the disc was creating a perceived sensation of movement, and the further away it was from the center, the stronger the sensation presented itself. So okay, that sounded pretty good. So I took the compositional lines and I started sketching level layouts and how I would manually arrange them on a canvas and recording what exactly was happening in my brain while I was doing it. What are the internal guidelines I'm following? And I noticed a very curious regularity. I would create misbalance at first based on some intersecting compositional lines, and then I would try to balance it out. And I would balance it out relative to the center of the canvas. So with the following visualization came to my mind. Imagine you have a plane surface of the size of your canvas that is balancing on the tip of a triangle, and it is perfectly stable until you put something on it. And in order to counter that new mass you just placed on the surface and prevent it from falling, you need to put something else in a very specific location with a certain mass to try to bring these imaginary scales back into the equilibrium. And a disclaimer right away, composition is a big topic where things like shape, value, direction, size, rhythm, all of them contribute to the perceived mass of the object. So instead of trying to encapsulate all of them at once, I'm going to be dealing purely with the size as a visual parameter of the mass function of an object. So how do we actually calculate the influence of an object on the equilibrium of our composition? Well, why not start with Newton's law of universal gravitation, since we are talking about compositional gravity, and this is a gravitational field version of Newton's law that simply reads that the gravitational force at a point J is the sum of all the directions to other points excluding self multiplied by their mass and divided by the distance between them. Easy. But as you probably remember from school physics classes, the closer the object is, the stronger its gravitational influence. Whereas in our case, we actually do not care as much for objects that are closer to our canvas center because they destabilize our composition much less than those that are placed in the farthest corners. So we have to kind of modify this formula a bit. First of all, who cares for constants? We can have our own constants with sliders and references. So, bye, we do not need you. You just clutter our viewport. With regards to accounting for compositional influence, it is actually inverse of the gravitational influence of Newton's formula. So we can just take that bottom part and move it up, because, as I mentioned, the further the object is from the center, the more critical it is to balance it out. And we are always going to be calculating only one point J, which is our canvas center. Though, potentially you can calculate also the border corners, as shown in Arnheim's illustration, or some compositional lines intersections, which actually would be pretty sweet. So this is a demonstration of both Newton's formula and our modified compositional gravitation formula, just to give you some visual reference of how those forces affect our canvas. And with Newton's formula, you can clearly see that the closer points around the object get attracted to it, which you can observe by the vector magnitude and direction that is pointing towards the sphere. Whereas our compositional gravitation formula does exactly the opposite. The closer the point is, less affected it is by our sphere. And of course, we can modify the strength, influence distance, and the spread of this force. Oh, and by the way, it doesn't have to be only one object affecting our canvas. We can have as many as we want. And as you can see, with addition of a new object, they start to kind of fight for the influence on the canvas points. And the bigger the mass of the second object is, the more it pulls everything towards itself. So let's say we have our initial disbalancing object, which is indicated as a red circle here, and our center point is being pulled towards that object by a force which I named G1. So how do we actually figure out where to place a counterbalance in this case? Well, first of all, we need candidates, and I sample them randomly based on normal distribution and the direction that is determined by dot product relative to G1, and that just gives me an opposite side of the canvas relative to that vector. So let's say we are currently checking this particular green point out of all the candidates. And the influence of green point on the center of our canvas we will call G2. So the challenge becomes figuring out what best G2 can be in order to minimize the sum of G1 and G2, because we want this green point to balance out the canvas so much that the center goes back to equilibrium, which means zero vector, as all the forces cancel each other out. And we do not actually care about the direction of the sum vector, we just care that its magnitude should be as close to zero as possible. And if you remember, we can calculate magnitude with Euclidean distance, which is a square root of sum of x squared and y squared in 2 dimensions. And those x and y can be easily calculated because our sum vectors x and y are nothing more than simply adding x's of j1 and j2 and y's of j1 and j2 accordingly, which is a basic rule of vector addition. And in order to calculate x and y's of J2, since we do not know yet what G2 is, we can just use our compositional gravity formula, which states that vector G2 is the mass of the object multiplied by distance to the center of the canvas squared and multiplied by its direction. So I hope you're still with me, and here is a more visual representation of what we're trying to do. So here we have our center of composition. And the red line represents the pull vector towards the sphere. The green point also has an influence on the center, which is the green line. And the sum of green and red lines is indicated with blue line. And all we are trying to achieve here is to make this blue line as short as possible. And as you can see, we kind of have a huge possibility space. We can make the green line shorter or longer. But how do we programmatically find the best green line length that minimizes the blue line? So here's just a cleaned up version of the formula for the blue line's magnitude, and as I mentioned before, we want it as small as possible. This formula might seem like a lot of variables, but hey, remember, all of those are actually known to us, all except the mass of the green point, which is the lower m here. And to make calculations less cluttered, let's just assume that mr squared is a capital M, and that is what we are trying to find. And since we're trying to minimize the formula, we just take a derivative and we get this beautiful boy on the bottom. It might seem somewhat complex, but once you actually solve for zero, it becomes nice and cuddly. And by the way, we are solving for zero because we want to find the minimum of the function, and this function always has only one, so we are super lucky. So once we calculated our capital M, it becomes a piece of cake to get our mass value out of it. Or you can easily reverse the last step and guess distance based on mass if you want to figure out how far you should place given mass for most equilibrium. However, in practice, it can cause a lot of self-intersection with other objects, so I prefer to randomly sample position and calculate the mass rather than the other way around. And potentially, you do not even need to go through this math. You can just randomly sample masses and hope you find a good one, as we do not really need our algorithm to be too perfect, otherwise it will balance out our composition too quickly without adding enough elements. And that is exactly why I'm not finding both math and distance and maybe even direction this way, as I want there to be imperfection and a chance of randomness. So here is just a visualization of the algorithm finding the best G2 vector for the green point. And as you can see, we are sampling multiple green points and they have various successes. Some of them have longer blue lines, some of them actually almost perfect. So we calculate, let's say, 30 of them, and then we just measure which one did best. And that is the one we keep. Once we associate mass with size, we have something like this, where blue circles are initially placed based on compositional lines intersection to create some disbalance, and the gray ones are created by the algorithm that tries to achieve compositional gravity equilibrium. And since there is a randomness factor involved, you can also just change the seed, which will alter the way the algorithm arranges new masses for you. And circles, of course, are just for debugging, but that is actually what we use for placement of assets in Pikapika, where circles represent the bounding area for a given asset, or even a cluster of assets, as you can create both micro and micro compositions using this technique. This is just a quick couple of days prototype of the idea, but in the future it might be super interesting to include things like direction, value, and color in mass calculation, because right now, as I mentioned, the mass is calculated purely from the size of the object. But I think it might be a new and exciting way we think about procedural placement and scattering. And since we have a bit of time left, I can quickly show you two more algorithms used in the Pikapika procedural system. So for the floor, we simply fill the target shape with rectangles, and since everything is grid-based, it is very simple to check for overlap. To create more irregular shapes, we merge the tiles together based on their touch perimeter, which gives us quite a big variety of floor arrangements. And the target shapes can also be driven by the compositional gravity algorithm. The conveyor belts are a simple pathfinding problem, where we initially create the main lines and then connect the rest of the input points to them. Also notice that the conveyors have a gradient which indicates their direction for gameplay purposes. So that is kind of the end of the presentation. On the final note, I want to wholeheartedly thank everyone involved in Pikapika project. You guys are the best. And also, if you are interested in other aspects of the project, do check out these talks. They should be available on our website at ea.com/seed. And that would be it. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, SideFX, for inviting me. And I wish you a very lovely day and more procedural awesomeness to come.